Hello, Humanities 1302, and welcome to our first lecture of the semester covering society in medieval England. Now, before we get started with this lecture, I just wanted to kind of briefly highlight really what lectures are generically going to look like throughout the semester. Now, as we talk about society within medieval England, I do want to point out that I'm going to really break up our discussion of medieval culture and also future cultures into several videos. For this one, we're going to be focusing just on society, the caste systems that were in place, what the ruling and the lower classes looked like, as well as kind of the tensions that begin to develop between them, if any at all. So we'll be talking about that today in this video. But in regards to religion, which does play a major role within society within medieval England, as well as in other periods, I'll be discussing that in a separate video. And we'll talk about how religious dynamics are also going to influence some of the tensions that we see develop within some of these periods. Also, on the topics of art and literature, which will prove very influential for those who will be fighting out on the battlefield, as well as for growing ideas during these periods, that will also be saved for a future lecture video. And then I'll give overviews of the conflicts we'll be discussing, as well as their legacies and the soldiers' experience in them, and I'll talk more about that in the future. But anyways, now that we have kind of a brief overview of what these lectures will look like, let's go ahead and dive into our first topic today, that of the topic of society and what it looks like in medieval England. Now, when you think about the Dark Ages, when you think about medieval Europe, usually what comes to mind for individuals that have a great understanding of this period is a feudalistic system that's going to dominate really the latter portions of the medieval period. Now, first, before we start talking about feudalism, I wanted to talk about why we're in the medieval period and what's really resulting as a result of previous periods. Really, the medieval period in Europe, it follows what has happened with the decline of the classical era. We see in the 400s that the Roman Empire collapses, and as a result, really, Europe kind of goes into chaos, if you will. From here, the feudalistic system doesn't immediately develop, but after the 11th century, that's when you start to see the feudalistic system really begin to mature and develop as a result. Now, I do want to point out, during this period, many of the technologies and the classical views, like from philosophers and so forth, would be lost to this period, but we will start to see that some of those ideas will be discovered later on during this period, as well as during the Renaissance. We'll talk about that in the future. But anyways, returning back to feudalism, what does it look like? Well, feudalism itself is going to really be a land system that's going to center around the king ruling in a particular realm. And in this case, we're going to take that of the King of England. He will be at the top of this system within the feudalistic system. Him, as well as a portion of the church, are going to own most of the land within their given realm. And as you can probably guess, a king trying to govern the entirety of his land is going to prove to be relatively difficult. And so to try to really help divide up governing this land to ensure that order is maintained in this land, he's going to hand out large parcels of his land to landlords or vassals. Now, these vassals/landlords typically, well, I shouldn't say typically, they are going to be members of the nobility, of the upper class, wealthier individuals, who in exchange for receiving these large parcels of land are going to basically pledge allegiance to the king. They're going to provide him with serfs and peasants to fight with a military service. They'll also provide knights and so forth for that military service. And they would also create a political alliance. So that way, if the king and his various fiefs that are under him, which the vassals would be at the head of some of these fiefs, if they were to go off to war against another realm, another king, and so forth, then they would provide troops, resources, and so forth to the king in that fight. But anyways, they would be the next really group underneath the king. But even though the parcels of the land that they're governing are going to be relatively large, it would be difficult for them, especially in the medieval period, to govern them. And so underneath them, you'll find lesser lords, and sometimes also characterized as the knights that would be fighting on behalf of the landlords. Now, these individuals are also going to be part of the nobility, but just to kind of keep this in simple terms, think of really the nobility as these billionaires and the lesser lords as millionaires. So they are relatively rich, but they're not on the same level as those above them. These lesser lords, there could be a third layer of lords below them. They're going to be governing a local province, a local city. They're going to be the ones appointing mayors, and so on and so forth. And they're largely going to be ruling over the bulk of the European and the English population and the peasantry. Now, the peasants themselves, they are going to make up well over 80% of the population of Europe. And they're going to be at the bottom of the social order. Now, the peasants themselves, they're also part of this chain where they're going to pledge basically their allegiance to their respective lord. Now, with the allegiance that they do pledge, basically what they're saying is that they are going to till the land, they're going to provide economically for that lesser lord's land, and also in times of war they would also provide military service. Now, about 70% of the European population at this time, during the 11th, 12th, and then into the 13th centuries, are going to be what are called serfs, who are also part of these peasants. Not all of these peasants are going to be what we would consider nowadays free, to where they could freely kind of move between lords and so forth. Most of them are going to be serfs. They would be economically tied to the land. They had to pay rent to the respective lord. They had to provide him with a certain amount of their crops and so on and so forth. And this system would dominate Europe, as I mentioned, for a few centuries. And we start to see by the 14th century, as well as the 15th century, that there were challenges being made to this particular social order, which we'll talk about with the Peasants' Revolt a little bit later on. But a few other notes that I do want to make about feudalism is that really it's this very weak structure for government, if you will, especially in regards to these landlords. It is quite possible that a king or a landlord could own land not only in, say, England, but also over in France. And that's going to create a conflict of interest because, technically speaking, you could find two landlords that have allegiances to two different kings. And we'll talk about the importance of that, especially as we get to the 100 Years' War a little bit later on, but that's something just to keep in mind. Now, this feudalistic system, as I mentioned, would remain in place for a few hundred years, but it begins to change because there will be a major event that will rock Europe during the middle of the 1300s that's going to decimate the peasant population and make their labor much more valuable. And we'll talk about that significance here in just a second with the Black Death. But before we get there, one last note I do want to point out about the feudalistic system and how it's going to impact really warfare during this period is going to be this idea known as the Code of Chivalry. Now, the Code of Chivalry is really going to dominate, if you will, how knights as well as lords are going to conduct themselves in warfare during this period. Now, it is not uncommon for you when we talk about some of these battles, Agincourt being one of them, and we'll talk about several others during the 100 Years' War, for you to see a king, a lord, or a knight out on the battlefield. However, for them, as they go into battle, really warfare is where they could, if you will, test their manhood. And we'll see this will be somewhat of a common theme as we go throughout various periods of not only European, but American as well as world history. But anyways, with the Code of Chivalry, it'll be a set of behaviors between knightly opponents. And a part of this respect, as they're testing themselves out in open combat, is that if they were not killed, the hope was that they would be taken prisoner by their fellow knight, and as a result, they would be held in ransom and it was expected that they would have good treatment as a result of this. This was because they were hoping that their status as a knight, as a lord, even a king, would be recognized by those individuals. And this is going to impact the soldier's experience out in the battlefield, and we'll talk about that and read about that within the Face of Battle in Chapter 2, because it's going to make these individuals very desirable, especially for the peasantry, because in times of war, that is a motivation for them to potentially capture a knight that they could then use as ransom and gain their own fortune. But anyways, that's a topic we'll go into more detail as we get to the soldier's experience during the 100 Years' War. But anyways, the Code of Chivalry will be just one aspect of this feudalistic system that we see dominate in Europe. But as I mentioned a moment ago, that begins to collapse when we see the outbreak of the Black Death during the 1340s that's being spread by rats that really were able to travel over to Europe because of the new interconnectedness that we see of the globe emerging by the 1300s. Now, the bubonic plague, the Black Death, the Black Plague, however you characterize it, it breaks out in Europe during the 1340s. And what it's going to do is decimate specifically the peasantry population, but also the European population at large. Now, it's estimated by historians that somewhere in the neighborhood between 40 and 50% of the population will die. Many historians often leaning more towards this latter number. And think about the impacts on a society if 50% of that population were to die in just a few short years. Really, the height of the Black Death within Europe will occur from 1346 when it arrives in Constantinople up until we get to the first couple of years of the 1350s. So you're talking about a population in the millions being cut in half by this disease within the matter of just a few years. And so that's going to have major implications, especially for the social order that we see over in England. Now, for England specifically, the Black Death doesn't arrive into the country until the 1348. Now, the reason that it arrives is because of the transfer of these diseases via rats. Now, these rats were originally infected over in Asia, and eventually they began to spread over to Europe with the bubonic disease. Now, how does that occur? Well, it's because of the more interconnectedness of the globe by this period. Following the Crusades that had begun in the late 1100s, it was the efforts by Western Christendom to reclaim the Holy Land from the Islamic caliphates there. After the Crusades take place, what that's significant for the Western world is it opens up the Western world really for the rest of the outside world. No longer we see England, France, and so forth as really isolated in their territories. Now they were beginning to gain knowledge of the Middle Eastern nations. Now they're beginning to gain knowledge of India, China. They get involved in the silk trade that we see out there along the Silk Road and so forth. But with this interconnectedness, now that they're more involved in trade, this makes the spread of disease much easier. And as a result, infected rats, once again over in Asia, begin to spread over to Europe by the 1340s. And in 1348, the bubonic plague has arrived over in England. And just like other European countries at this point, 50% of their population is going to die. Most of it is going to be the peasantry. And we'll see that the death rate amongst the nobility, the upper classes, while it is relatively high at 25%, we'll see because of the fact that they had really the opportunities to move out to the countryside away from heavily populated areas, it allowed them the opportunity to have a smaller mortality rate. But anyways, for the 50% or more peasants that die as a result of the Black Plague, how significant for the impact on the social order is their labor is going to be much more valuable. The reason being is because no longer do you have so many serfs, so many peasants that could work the land to where their labor is relatively cheap. And now that they start to see them as a more desirable commodity, you start to see that they look to exert that economic influence to perhaps bring about not only economic rights but also political rights. And this is where the nobility is going to begin to respond. And over the course of the next 40 years, you start to see within English society tensions begin to mount. And really, this is going to precursor a lot of the tensions that we'll see develop, especially as we get up to the Age of Revolution 300 years in the distant future. But anyways, looking at the events that follow, because now that they perceive their value as laborers at a much higher rate, you start to see that these peasants begin to be challenged by the nobility who want to maintain the social order, that want to maintain their positions within the current social caste. And the nobility, in response to the peasants and their demand for more economic rights, are going to begin to pass a series of ordinances and statutes. You'll read about some of these in the materials this week, but those ordinances are going to be the Ordinance of Laborers in 1349 and the Statute of Laborers in 1351. And essentially all what they're trying to do is restrict the economic rights of these laborers and trying to maintain the nobility, the lords, at their current economic positions. And over the course of the next 30 some odd years, with those ordinances in place, now that we start to see peasants recognizing that their labor was much more valuable than it had been in previous decades, tensions begin to develop. Tensions that eventually boil out in what's known as the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. But I also want to point out, too, with these ordinances, taxes from the 100 Years' War are also going to have a significant impact on why these peasants would revolt in 1381. So now let's talk about what these peasants were demanding in 1381 and whether or not their demands would be met. So the Peasant Revolt of 1381 that breaks out in the summer of that year is going to be led by a man by the name of Wat Tyler as well as that of John Ball. Now, both these individuals, when they lead this revolt, they are going to march on London with thousands of peasants who really were frustrated by the tensions that we had seen develop between them and the nobility over the course of the previous 40 years. And when they march on the capital at London, they're going to begin to burn buildings to the ground, specifically government buildings. They're going to target legal documents, which we'll talk about the importance of that here in a second. And they're also going to execute a number of individuals, including that of the Archbishop of Canterbury. Now, I do want to point out really quickly here with the Archbishop of Canterbury, this demonstrates really the significant role that the church does play within society during the medieval period. But once again, I will be saving my discussion of religion within medieval England for a future video. But anyways, effectively, through their revolt, being widely successful at this point, this would draw the attention of the king, that of Richard II. Now, Richard II, his role within this larger revolt that was beginning to take place, it really stems from what's happening in the 100 Years' War, as well as the fact that he takes over from his predecessor, Edward III, when he was 9 years old. He's a relatively young king, controversial, and oftentimes he would only really listen to his servants as opposed to give out his own sort of orders. And many of those individuals, you could probably guess, were looking out for the interests of the nobility class. Now, Richard II would agree to meet with these two individuals, with both Tyler as well as Ball, on two separate occasions. And with it, he looks to agree, at least initially, with the demands of what the peasants were raising. Now, their demands to try to improve the peasantry's condition is they both are going to demand for the abolition of serfdom. It was that system that we had talked about within the feudalistic system that had really kept them from achieving any sort of economic or even social mobility. Also, a part of the demands that Tyler and Ball are going to make is they're also going to call for the standardization of land rents. This way, once again, economically, their lords wouldn't take advantage of them, so that way they could have these standardized land rents. So once again, they could hopefully achieve some sort of economic or social mobility from the current conditions. Now, initially, King Richard is going to agree to these demands. However, who knows why he actually did this? Because eventually what will happen is upon their second meeting, violence is going to break out, Tyler is going to be killed, and when that happens, the King of England is going to reassert his authority over the city of London through his allies. From this, he'll restore order, and with that, crush the revolt. Now, the ideas that they were pursuing, they're not going to die away. We will continue to see social tensions be prevalent within medieval England and for future years to come. But this was really the first kind of event that we start to see the peasantry challenge that feudalistic system. That really does begin to collapse as we enter the next century during the 1400s. But anyways, we'll talk more about some of those revolts as my light goes out here, folks. We'll talk more about some of these revolts and those tensions that emerged in the 1400s and how it's going to impact that soldier's experience by the time we get to Agincourt in the 1400s. But anyways, for us today, that's really where I wanted to go ahead and end up on society within medieval England. But I do want to point out one last thing, and we'll talk a lot about it in regards to literature and arts within the medieval period. But as we see this revolt, as it was successful for a time by burning London, by executing the Archbishop of Canterbury, I told y'all to remember the issue of burning legal documents. Why is this important? Well, it's because by this point, while the printing press was still roughly, I believe, 70 years before it would come into fruition to where we'd start to see that printing would be widespread and literacy rates would begin to rise, we do start to see that there was at least a knowledge going around amongst the peasantry class for the demand to become literate. Because documents to them were power. In order to control really the legislature, the legal process, they needed to control the documents. And that's why they begin to set on burning those documents, and also why we're going to see they're going to put an emphasis on learning how to read and write in order to control that literature so that way they could have power through those documents. But anyways, we'll talk about that when we get to literature and arts during the medieval period. But we're going to go ahead and end on that note. Before we do go ahead and end this lecture, I'll say this every time we end, make sure that you are going through all this week's materials. You're watching not only this video, but all the videos that are released this week. Make sure you're reading all the articles. Make sure you're reading Chapter 2, In the Face of Battle by John Keegan. And make sure that you're just covering all of what we need to do in this class this week. But anyways, just like always, if you do have any questions, feel free to reach out. But otherwise, everybody go out, be safe, and I'll see everybody in the next video.